everybody, welcome to another Stuff Sketched with Gregg Schigiel. I am Gregg Schigiel, and on this episode, drawing Spider-Man. Spider-Man is a character, he's a character a lot of people love. A lot of people feel a very strong attachment to Spider-Man. Spider-Man was never one of my top guys. Um, I would watch the Amazing Spider-Man cartoon when it would run on Saturday mornings. It was reruns, but I would watch that. It was cool. I thought Spider-Man looked cool. I certainly put a pencil inside of my watch and pretended it was a web shooter. But in terms of Spider-Man comics, I did not really read a lot of Spider-Man comics. My older brother, who also read comics, he was a Spider-Man reader. He had a bunch of Spider-Man stuff, which worked out pretty well because he was buying Spider-Man comics when Todd McFarlane was drawing it, and that was a big splash for anybody who was paying attention, and I certainly started reading those. But I still was never, I would read it on and off, but I never was fully invested. Anyway, quick talk about the actual drawing. This is being drawn as per usual in Clip Studio Paint on a Cintiq drawing tablet. As per usual, I'm doing a lot of construction stuff, a lot of drawing, redrawing. Looking at the drawing now, I can tell you, if I could do it again, I would make Spider-Man's torso a little bit longer, his head either a little bit bigger, or just his body in general. I think I drew him a little too bulky. I tend to like to draw a leaner, ganglier Spider-Man, and this one he's looking a little beefier, which still looks all right. But when I do these drawings, I try and do them relatively quickly, so that I don't have to speed them up too much. This one is just over 2 times speed. So, in order so that you can actually see some of the drawing, I try and draw fairly quickly. So I'm not drawing and redrawing as much as I might for a professional job. But still breaking the figure down as I might normally. This one actually gets drawn in this very rough version, and then I do another pass cleaning it up before I start inking. So I guess in some regard this drawing took a little bit longer than past drawings. But you'll see I'm going to fade this out shortly and then basically draw almost the same thing but cleaner. A lot less drawing over and through. So if we use the cake analogy that I believe I mentioned in an earlier episode, or the baking analogy, this is reading the recipe, measuring out ingredients, and mixing them. And now this part is baking the cake, and then after this part will be frosting the cake. I still like that metaphor quite a bit. So yeah, here I'm putting a cleaner example of all the details, but you'll see I don't put the webbing in per se. I just sort of I set up for the webbing. Anyway, Spider-Man is not a character I have a lot of emotional sort of connection to, but I've drawn my fair share of Spider-Man over the years, possibly most notably for a certain generation of comic readers. I drew a Spider-Man anti-drug comic that appeared almost everywhere that it could, and that was a lot of fun doing that job. And then for a couple of years, or maybe a year, I can't remember, but a little while back, I was doing Spider-Man artwork for a series of Spider-Man magazines that were coming out in Italy or somewhere in Europe. And that job was a lot of me drawing sort of things just like this, single poses of Spider-Man, or Spider-Man fighting a villain or a series of villains or other heroes. It was fun. It was fun stuff to do. And if you see me at conventions, sometimes I bring some of that original artwork. And at some point, I should put it up on a website so people, if they want it, can buy it. So now you can see in this, as I'm cleaning it up, I'm refining some of the shapes. I'm pretty happy with that back leg. It has the right size and shape to it. His right leg, the lower leg that we're looking at, I think looking at is a little small. Yeah, the proportions aren't perfect in this drawing. I'm going to admit that. Maybe there's room at some point to do a drawing where I'm correcting old drawings, although that might get very boring for everybody involved, including me, to be honest. Now I've knocked out the very rough pencils, leaving my cleaned up pencils. Now I'm using things, moving it around compositionally, and now I'm frosting the cake, or I guess doing the inking, cleaning up the drawing, making it a final drawing. I posted this drawing, the finished drawing, a few days ago on Twitter, and a Twitter user had some questions at Cannon Hill Comic. So he asked who my favorite Spider-Man artists were. Uh, there's definitely obviously Todd McFarlane was compelling and interesting and drew me in. That said, in terms of and there was a period there where I would draw Spider-Man with very large eyes, very much in the Todd McFarlane fashion. The way he drew the webs, for sure. I think I still do that. I think everybody still does that to a certain degree. Michael Ringo's Spider-Man, absolutely, is probably is among my favorites. Um, I like John Byrne's Spider-Man. I basically like the sort of leaner, ganglier, sort of buggy-eyed Spider-Mans, which is interesting because in this particular drawing, I didn't draw him as buggy-eyed as I might in other cases. Um, oh, there's somebody else I'm thinking of. Hold on. Oh, I can't think of it now. Damn it. There's another name and it just left my head. It was in my head, and then it just left my head. Oh, Patrick Olaf, who was drawing Untold Tales of Spider-Man. I like that stuff a lot. I always happen to like that series quite a bit. So that I think that helps when you like the thing you're reading. It makes it all gel in a really nice way. Um, Marcos Martin's Spider-Man is awesome in due to how he draws and also just the layouts in general. Paul Azaceta did a really cool Spider-Man when he was drawing it. Different take, but it had a neat look to it. Uh, he was also asked, what do I think are the definitive Spider-Man artists? I mean, certainly Steve Ditko, John Romita Sr. Oh, John Romita Jr. for sure. Mark Bagley. I guess the people who have done long stretches sort of get that definitive. But again, as a guy who didn't read a ton of Spider-Man, I can't really rattle off, even though I just rattled off a bunch of names, I don't know that I could rattle off definitive Spider-Man. I don't think I'm in the position to make that claim. So, sorry, Johnny Cannon. And then his last question is, does Spider-Man wear socks under his costume? That's a great question. And I don't think he does. I think he wears his boots as his socks. Because I think on some level, and this gets into the sort of ridiculous kinds of conversations that you can get into as comic book fans and readers, like how sticky are his feet, right? Like they're obviously sticky enough to work through his feet and hands, are sticky enough to work through the gloves and the boots. But clearly the gloves, it's just glove and then bare hand. If he had boot or whatever it is, and then sock and then bare foot, that might be a layer too much for the Spider-Man stickiness to work its magic. So I think I always figured he went to work at the Daily Bugle or going out taking photos, and he had his boots on under his jeans or his pants. Hell, he had his Spider-Man leggings on under all that. And then when he had to change, like everything was under there, and then he just put the mask on. A lot of layers. Probably not great in the summer, but also it's a comic book, so the weather was probably perfect all the time unless the story dictated it needed to be hot or snowing. Comic books, everybody. Here I'm blocking in a lot of the blue parts of the costume, which end up being a lot of black, depending on your take. Clearly my take is to do a lot of black. But I don't do solid black. I know some people think of it as a red and black costume with blue highlights. Some people think of it as a red and blue costume with black shadows. I think I'm in the red and blue with black shadows. I don't know what was happening here and why I was having so much trouble with this knee the shin and knee shading. Just something wasn't, my synapses weren't going, but I think I get it on the next pass. Yeah, I think this is where I finally, yeah, this is where I figured it out. See, in general, I think in this drawing his head's a little too small because it's the shoulders look too broad. Uh, Something that I think is slightly interesting is despite all the work I did earlier in building the construction, the musculature under the costume, all that stuff, when it's actually drawn, I don't really show any of it outside of the collarbones there, because it all becomes this webbing. And to me, if you start adding a ton of musculature in there, it just gets messy. The webbing is and of itself a unique design feature. It's a little bit of a pain to draw because it's just a bunch of little lines. But once if you start adding too much definition to musculature, it just, I don't know. I find that it clutters things up and it makes for a less clean, pretty drawing. So the webbing, I'm doing it pretty rough here. If I was doing this as a professional paying job, it would be much more refined. I'd take a lot more care into how the webbing looked in 3 dimensions, shape and form and all that. But you get the gist. And then the eyes. They're not small, but they're not as big as, I mean, I have some drawings I did when I was in college and was an intern where I really went far out with those eyes. Like they took up most of his face in a way that was probably unnecessary. There have been other people talking about how the webbing works, the pattern, how it all comes from that point between his eyes. I'm sure there are videos on YouTube where you can watch that, but basically everything starts from that little, what is it, like a hexagon between his 2 eyes, and then it all radiates out from there. So you can see the face starts, and then if you imagine all that going around his neck, and then it goes down the chest, like so. And you kind of want it to have a system to it. So you're going to see here, this was some poor planning, because when I get to the belt part, I wanted things to line up. So once I erase it, I sort of started from there, and it evens it. The spacing works out a little better. And the other thing you try and do with the webbing is to create the form. So you could see that with that glove, each section of the web is a curve, and then it follows a curve of the forearm. Or as you'll see on this last boot, you want to keep the depth and form of the calf in place, so the web lines work along that plane. So then a little more cleaning up of stuff. Then I go in with some white and redefine some of the leg stuff that got lost by spotting all the blacks. Gets all cleaned up, and that's a finished Spider-Man drawing. I think I'm about to sign it. Yep. Thanks for watching. That's about all the stuff I have left to say. I'll see you next time.